different perspectives, to share with you their research, their findings, and to deepen your appreciation for the humanities. Before I introduce today's speaker, let me just tell you what the protocols are. Number one, you can expect that we've done this before. I should be able to do this without stumbling over my words. Our speaker will speak for about 45 minutes, 50 minutes, at which point there's Q&A. We always end right at 4:45. So we ask you, to stick around for the Q&A, and we especially ask you, if you're a student, to formulate a question, because professors are not allowed to ask the first question. It's on you. Second thing to know is that when that microphone comes to you, you should say your name and then say your question. Third thing to know is that afterwards, down in the great room, there is a reception. And so you should definitely go there and get a little bit of food before the weekend begins. And the last thing to know is if your face is currently illuminated by a screen, you got to shut that screen down. I'm sorry. You'll thank me afterwards because you'll be more fully present in the room, paying attention to what's going on. You can see the recording next week on our website. If you got paper and pencil, you got all you need. Okay. So, we're delighted to welcome today to the Humanities Forum Tara Isabella Burton. She's the author of the novels Social Creature, The World Cannot Give, and Here in Avalon, as well as nonfiction books Strange Rites, New Religions for a Godless World, and Self-Made, Curating Our Image from Da Vinci to the Kardashians. And today's talk, which I think is a preview of the book that she's working on right now, a little bit, which is coming out next year. This is going to be on magic and modernity. This talk you could kind of think about of pulling on those two strands. She's really interested in the role that religion plays in a secular modern society, and also the ways in which people are interested in making themselves, fashioning themselves, building themselves into something other than what we are. Tara's writing has appeared in both fiction and nonfiction in the New York Times, National Geographic, Granta, the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, and more. She co-writes the Substack newsletter Line of Beauty with her husband, Dhananjay Jagannathan. And so she comes to us, so even though you hear, okay, she's written novels, she's a journalist, etc., she's also has her roots as an academic. She received a doctorate in theology from Oxford and is currently a visiting fellow at George Mason University's Mercatus Center and a visiting research fellow at the Catholic University of America's Institutional Flourishing Lab. So please give a warm Providence College welcome to Tara Isabella Burton.
Thank you all so much for being here. Thank you so much, Ian, for inviting me. So I'd like to start off by explaining this rather interesting graphic behind me. Has anyone either seen this before or seen news stories about Brian Johnson? Quick show of hands. Yes, the one with the blood boy. Ringing any bells? All right, well, Brian Johnson is a tech investor known for a company called Kestrel, who came to real sort of news media prominence over the past few months and couple of years because of his passionate interest in extreme life extension. So Brian Johnson does many things to keep fit, to make sure that he's in his mid-50s, I believe, but that his biological age is much younger. Some of them pretty straightforward, eating clean, making sure he gets a lot of sleep. Some of them less obvious. For example, he injects himself with his young son's blood. And Brian Johnson now has a new company called Blueprint, where he shares some of these perhaps more attainable, some of these less attainable life tips to people who want to, like him, live a little longer. Except Brian Johnson doesn't just want to live a little bit longer. That's sort of a start. But what Brian Johnson actually wants, and he has said this explicitly, is to live forever. And not only does he want to live forever, he wants to make it so that you can live forever. And so recently, a couple of months ago on the platform X, I think we can now start saying X rather than X, formerly known as Twitter. We're in that time. He exhorted his followers to join him in this new religion, which he calls Don't Die. Pretty straightforward. He calls it a religion that will, quote, usher in an existence more spectacular than we can imagine. And he claims that he is not merely a tech tycoon or a biohacker. Rather, he writes, I am playing for societal scale philosophical transformation, competing for the status and authority of Jesus, Satan, Buddha, he misspells Buddha, and similar. In a related interview on X, he sums up his goals even more explicitly. I'm wanting to trade off what I think is primitive joy now of the debauchery of doing things, eating carbs or what have you, versus what could be this existence. The level of ambitions of what I think are possible, he says. Level 1, start a company. Level 2, start a country. Level 3, start a religion. Level 4, don't die. Level 5, become God. So this graphic behind me is the official Brian Johnson provided graphic for the Don't Die movement. So as you keep Brian Johnson in mind, I want to also invite you to keep another sort of internet anomaly, a moment in contemporary internet life in mind. The second thing I want to invite you to consider is the phenomenon of manifesting. Another show of hands. Who here has heard of manifesting? All right, almost everybody. Keep your hands up. How many of you have tried it? No, it is actually, it makes you, 20% of Americans say they've tried it. So you're actually above I think that was more than 20% of hands. But again, I think this scales with age. And about over half of Americans say they believe in it. So for those of you who are not familiar with manifesting, which seems actually not very many of you, it is basically a phenomenon somewhere between spirituality and self-help. Largely, I would say, now on TikTok, although on other social media platforms as well, that argues that if we can focus our attention, our will, our desires on the image of what we want, be that health, be it wealth, be it that the guy that we like texting us back, we can manifest that into reality. What happens inside our minds corresponds to the energies of the universe. And increasingly, manifesting has become a social media phenomenon. These numbers are a couple of months now out of date, but you have major influencers like Manifest with Gabby, with her 130,000 odd followers, who pursues abundance. You have influencers like Lila, the manifestress, who has about 70,000 followers, who can offer you a special manifestation sort of incantation you can use to get someone that you like that doesn't maybe like you to text you back. And now I want to invite you to consider a third moment in let's say weird cultural media history. And this is from January 2020, right before the pandemic. And it's an advertising campaign from one particular high-end boutique fitness chain known as Equinox. I don't know if there's one in Providence. I feel like there probably is. So produced by the marketing studio Droga 5, this campaign is entitled Make Yourself a Gift to the World. And it features a series of images devoted to the ideal gym goer as a kind of mythological demigod of self-care. One of the posters features a powerful woman who's easily lifting up two men like the biblical Samson. Another features a shirtless man lying on a funeral pyre attended by frenetic worshipers. And the purpose of this campaign, according to the marketing firm, is to depict, quote, divine characters as godlike gifts to the world in moments and situations that reflect their self-worship as serving a larger purpose to humanity. Asking the question, this is also a quote, does that not make self-obsession the most selfless act of all? Or as the chief marketer tells a journalist, we're targeting individuals dedicated to becoming the very best they can be because, quote, when you become the best version of yourself, you radiate outward and contribute more to the world around you. Now, all three of these examples I've just given from about the past 5 years interest me for the same reason. Whether you're playing with vibes on the internet because you're trying to manifest your way into, I don't know, more wealth, whether you're Brian Johnson injecting yourself with your son's blood, or you're just, subscribing to Brian Johnson's newsletter for life extension, or whether you're just going to Equinox and doing a gym class and practicing self-care, you, a sort of collective you, may be participating in what I will be arguing in this new book, has become something of America's new civil religion in the age of the so-called secular age. And that is this idea of self-divinization, that divinity is not something out there or up there or other than us, but rather something that we can hack into, tap into within ourselves. That what it means to be in touch with the divine, to be close to the divine, is not just to worship God, but to become God. This is an idea that, as I will argue, is not new. It is not exclusively modern. It is one with a long history, both in American religious life and more broadly in Western culture. But it is one that has been turbocharged by the internet, one that has gone from being, one might say, a fringe idea into being very much the norm. This what I call magical transhumanism, the idea that we can make ourselves into God, is the closest thing we have today to a shared religious and cultural language. So I want to start by giving a kind of pulling back a bit and saying what is, looking at the broader American religious landscape. So the largest single religious bloc in the United States right now is the religious nuns. So that's the N-O-N-E-S nuns, not the N-U-N-S nuns. It does not actually mean people who are not religious or not spiritual. What it means is people who, when given a form by the Pew or another polling firm, do not tick the Christian box or the Jewish box or the Muslim box or what have you. They tick none, religiously unaffiliated. And this makes up about a quarter of Americans today, and that number is only rising. When I wrote about this in Strange Rights back in I was drafting the book in 2018. It was between 20 and 25%, and now those numbers are now out of date. It's between 25 and 30. For younger people, which is to say young millennials, members of Generation Z, that percentage goes all the way up to about 36%. So the religiously unaffiliated are not only the single largest religious group. That does involve, like, for example, breaking down Christians. You have Protestants and Catholics and evangelicals and what have you. So it's not a Christians versus nuns, but it's the largest sort of single group. But they're also the fastest growing group, and they are projected to be within a couple of decades probably more than 50% of Americans. Now, that does not mean, importantly, that 50% or let's say 25% of Americans now are atheists or agnostic or don't believe in anything. Now, I think there's some disagreement because atheists do tend to under-self-report in surveys, but only about 6% of Americans identify as atheists. And actually, about 72% of people who identify as religious nuns believe in some sort of higher power. About 20% of them believe in what I think the polling firm refers to it as the God of the Bible. So the God of, I think it's sort of the God of Jewish, Christian, or Islamic tradition is about 20% of that. I don't think it's the best written polling question, but you can get a sense of how people might answer that. So the question then remains, all right, we're seeing a huge numbers of Americans resistant to organized religion, resistant to ritual, resistant to institutional religion, but who are not necessarily leaving religion behind. Instead, what they're doing, and I argue this in my first nonfiction book, Strange Rights, is they're remixing religion. They're picking and choosing, they're mixing and matching, they're taking elements from established religious traditions, elements from, let's say, New Age practices like yoga or tarot or stage cleansing. They're getting their meaning, their purpose, their rituals, their communities from a bunch of different sources. And this is not exclusively the practices among, let's say, the spiritual but not religious. It's also the case that people who might identify as religious on a form, let's say they tick the Jewish box or they tick the Christian box, are also practicing religious remixing. One of my favorite statistics from this is a 2018 Pew poll where about a third of self-identified Christians say they believe in reincarnation. So not something that is perhaps part of the Orthodox Christian doctrine, but it reflects the fact that there is this tendency, particularly in the United States, to essentially create one's own religion, to mix and match and say what works for me, what makes me feel in touch with the divine, what makes me feel close to God, what makes me feel a sense of higher meaning, what makes me feel a sense of purpose. And in Strange Rights, I looked at a few of these different phenomena that I sort of can be considered some of the bases for religious remixing. For example, the rise of interest in sort of new age, Wicca, witchcraft. This was really particularly had a moment about 2016, 17, 18 in the wake of the first Donald Trump's first election, where witchcraft became not just a spiritual practice, but a kind of political identity, particularly among sort of left-leaning young women who saw it as an act of political resistance to what they saw as a kind of the Christian establishment. I also looked at wellness culture and the ideas of energy and connectedness and being your best self, like in this equinox example I just gave you, that provided adherents with a sense of somehow purifying themselves, of getting closer to their higher purpose. Now, there's two ways of thinking about religious remixing. And one is just that we're all just mixing and matching whatever. That there's that in this new American religious landscape where we're more focused on what feels good or what we are makes us feel close to God or or looking within rather than institutional authority. Anything that works for us works. That there's no real commonality to wellness culture or New Age culture or fandom or technological transhumanism, what I call techno-utopianism, the sort of belief in the power of technology that gives us figures like Brian Johnson. But I think there's another way of thinking about religious remixing that is a little more accurate, which is to say that, as Marshall McLuhan would say, the medium is the message. The content and the form of religious remixing actually fit together, that there's an implicit set of metaphysical assumptions, ethical assumptions, assumptions about God in the act, like encoded in our proclivity to remix. And that assumption is that what it means to be human, ultimately, is to try and transcend our own humanity. That if there is some kind of divine force in the world, some kind of God, some kind of something, it is not out there as the most traditional Western religious understandings might have it, but rather God is within. God is a force, an energy, a feeling that we can access if we look inwards, if we listen to our own desires, if we listen to our hearts, and perhaps even an energy we can also harness. That if we correctly understand what's going on within ourselves, if we achieve a kind of spiritual knowledge, we too can harness God, and ultimately we can become God. We can become divine. This is not new. In fact, this particular idea of self-divinization in, at least, and I'm speaking specifically now about the Western world here, I'm just sort of confining argument to one geographic area, is pretty much as old as at least Christianity itself, which is to say, around the same time that what scholars often call proto-Orthodox Christianity is developing in the late antique world, the 2nd, 3rd, 4th centuries after the birth of Christ, other religious movements, religious sensibilities, religious ideas are flourishing. I think some of the more sort of famous ones that we come across often, if we study theology from a Christian point of view, are like the famous heresies, like Gnosticism. But I prefer to think of it as a kind of intellectual soup that in areas like 3rd, 4th century Alexandria, as early Christians are trying to work out this question of what does it mean for Jesus to be fully human and fully divine, how do we think about the relationship between God and human beings, there are other religious sensibilities that come up with very different answers and very different emphases. There are, as I've already said, the Gnostics, there's Neoplatonists, there's another tradition, one that becomes ultimately very important a millennium later, which is the Hermetic tradition, a tradition of, it's somewhere between a religion, a mystery cult, a set of practices. We don't actually know as much about it. Scholars don't know as much about it as they would like. But there seems to be, as around the same time as Christianity is developing, as the sort of Council of Nicaea is going on, as Christianity is becoming a formal religion, this religious strain. And complicating things, so the Hermetic tradition is basically centered around a group of books that are ostensibly written in ancient Egypt by an ancient Egyptian sort of god priest who is both sort of Hermes from the Greek pantheon, the god of trickery and technology, but also Thoth, the Egyptian god of writing, and he's a priest, and he's a magician, and he's an alchemist, he's invented the philosopher's stone, and he has some kind of god-like powers. And he is the attributed author of a bunch of texts that are in fact written over many centuries. Magical texts, alchemical texts, and religious texts. Now, most scholars believe, it's pretty sort of extremely likely, that there was not one person who is known as Hermes Trismegistus. Whoever did write these texts, particularly the more magical texts, was not writing in ancient Egypt. He was writing many thousands of years, couple thousand years later in this late antique era. So again, about as far from ancient Egypt to the birth of Christ as the birth of Christ is to right now, just to give you a historical sense of it. But what these sort of texts have in common is a desire to kind of tell a different story about creation, about humanity, that is in some ways similar to, let's say, the Orthodox Christian account, and in some ways very, very different. It's also very much influenced by both Plato and this sort of other contemporary movement called Neoplatonism, and if I had 3 hours instead of 45 minutes, we'd go into that. But the short version is basically this, that the wise, learned mage, the spiritual adept who understands how the world works, an understanding that is both about internal spiritual knowledge, or gnosis, it's gnosis, but with a G at the beginning. I'm just trying to clarify that. Through gnosis and through sort of a knowledge of correspondences, of the workings of the world, the truly wise individual can attain a sort of enlightenment that provides not just kind of closeness to God, but in fact, identity with God. That the purpose of being human is to become immortal through knowledge and through a kind of command of technology. So there's within the Corpus Hermeticum, which is this sort of the primary text, we learn that the follower of the Hermetic way must be born again, must get a immortal body, and finally that the final good for all who have received knowledge is to be made God. So sounds a little bit like Brian Johnson here. Now, this was not a big religious movement or even a religious movement at all. It seems to have been a sort of small, at most, a small kind of mystery cult. But about 1,000 years later, a little more than 1,000 years later, something interesting happens, which is that these texts, along with several other texts, re-enters the Western popular consciousness during the Italian Renaissance, particularly in Florence in the court of Cosimo de' Medici. So Cosimo de' Medici, he's a humanist. He's a wealthy man. He wants to emphasize the importance of Florentine learning and culture. So one of the ways he wants to do this is to revive the ancient world, and he hires his court translators, men like Marsilio Ficino, to find these Greek texts and translate them into Latin and kind of create this new library. And Ficino in particular is doing a lot of translations of Plato. He's doing a lot of translations of other Greek texts. But as soon as they find this manuscript of the Corpus Hermeticum, Cosimo says, stop Plato, like put Plato on hold. That's how important this is. Work on this instead, and Ficino does. And within this sort of small community in 15th century Alexandria, this sort of group of scholars and humanists and writers around the Medici court, begins a kind of revival of interest, not just in the magical parts of the Corpus Hermeticum or the magical parts of Hermetic thought, the idea that if you understand the correspondences between things, between a particular flower, a particular stone, a particular planet, you can somehow use them to cast certain kinds of spells to change the outcome of fate. But I think even more importantly, in this idea that there's what is necessary for human beings is to tap into their fundamental internal divinity and become God. And this gets a kind of revival, originally not necessarily as something outside of Christianity. Ficino, the translator, was a Christian priest and thought of this as like Christianity plus rather than something outside of it. But these ideas start to take hold in basically intellectual spaces, in humanist spaces, in spaces where people are wary of the influence of ecclesiastical powers, particularly the Catholic Church and in sort of Catholic areas. And they become often associated with broader ideas of human freedom and human power, and the idea that we can create our own destinies. One of the most famous philosophers of this era, who's a friend of Ficino's and is incredibly influenced by this idea, is a man named Giovanni Pico della Mirandola, who quotes heavily from the Corpus Hermeticum when he writes his Oration on the Dignity of Man, where he celebrates the idea that God has made human beings different from the rest of creation. The rest of creation has a purpose. It has animals, plants, they're all meant to do what they're meant to do. But instead, he conceives of God having made human beings to decide their own purpose. He retells Genesis, but in this version of Genesis, God kind of makes human beings and says, all right, I'm worn out, I'm tired, you take it from here, thou mayest fashion thyself. And this becomes hugely influential, both through the Renaissance and then kind of throughout the early modern era that follows. For time, I'm not going to go sort of deep into the history of Western esotericism here, but basically in pretty much every movement that follows, whether it's the Enlightenment, whether it's the birth of nationalism in the 19th century, whether it's indeed the founding of the United States, you find people who are involved with these movements who are also interested in the imagery, the ideas, the kind of religious and spiritual vocabulary of an esotericism that celebrates human freedom. For example, Rosicrucians, Freemasons, secret societies that are predicated on this idea that human freedom from authority is something to be celebrated, not just as a political good, but also a spiritual good. Now, I do want to sort of make a caveat here. I'm not saying, in a sort of Dan Brown Da Vinci Code-esque way, secret occultists run everything. I do not think that. But I think that a more complex version of this argument is that these ideas of kind of transhumanism and self-divinization, often in religious or semi-religious language and vocabularies and rituals, as you find, for example, in the development of Freemasonry, are attractive to people because they provide a set of symbols, a set of kind of powerful, a powerful vocabulary and rhetoric for celebrating a different vision of humanity that celebrates our individual autonomy. And this is something that one finds sort of throughout the Renaissance, throughout the Enlightenment. You find, pretty much everybody. I won't say everyone who's anybody was into it, but you find everyone from George Washington, Mason, to Giuseppe Garibaldi, Mason, to Isaac Newton, possible Rosicrucian, definitely really into alchemy, all kind of exploring the same thing. This idea that if human knowledge, if human creativity, if human freedom are so important, maybe we need religious language, religious symbols that can celebrate that. Now, there's a kind of, there's sort of two different ways that this expresses itself historically. In Europe in the 19th century, the interest in the esoteric tends to be a little more politically reactionary. It's associated with the right, and it's associated more with ideas about individual human beings that have certain kinds of power over others. That there's there's the herd out there who don't have these powers and don't have this knowledge, but there's certain people who can exert power over others because of their control of essentially magic. So figures like Julius Evola, who is not only an occultist but a noted fascist, wrote sort of lovingly of this idea of an elite who would differentiate themselves on a plane defined, and I'm quoting here, terms of spiritual virility, decisiveness, and impersonality, who will be the bearer of a new principle of a higher authority and sovereignty. So there's this idea that the techno-mage would be and this is very much inspired by Nietzsche's idea of the Übermensch, that the techno-mage would be able to control the world, so to speak. In the United States, it actually takes a very different direction, and a big part of that is the popularity of one sort of semi-esoteric movement from the 19th century known as New Thought. Quick show of hands, who has heard of New Thought? Okay, good news, it's easy. It's basically manifesting, which is to say it is a 19th century movement. It's founded by a sort of one former faith healer and clockmaker named Phineas Quimby, who doesn't understand why his faith healing isn't working. And he comes to the conclusion the reason it's not working is because people don't want to get better badly enough. That if people want to get well, they will. And he starts teaching this new thought. He develops a lot of followers, especially Mary Baker Eddy, who later founded the Church of Christian Science, inspired by these principles. And he gives rise to a sort of many generations worth of self-help books, all of which, kind of like Manifesting Today, claim that you are responsible for your own life, that if you can just get in touch with the divinity and the energies of the universe, you too can use desire to shape reality. So this starts out exclusively about wealth, about health, about faith healing, but by the end of the 19th century, it becomes much more about money. You have figures like John Fiske and James Allen and William Walter Atkinson, all of these writers who produce these like almost identical self-help books that all say the same thing. Like, if you close your eyes and picture yourself getting wealthy, it will happen, and if it doesn't happen, it's your fault. You didn't want it badly enough. And as one New Thought writer, Charles Fillmore, puts it, if we lack anything, it is because we have not used our mind in making the right contact with the supermind. So if something isn't happening, it's because our desires have been improperly harnessed. We've improperly harnessed the kind of vibes of the universe. So these two kind of twin ideas that we should make ourselves into gods, that our reality is downstream of our desires, that if we can harness our internal energy, our internal knowledge, we can shape reality, and this sort of distinctly European version of it, this reactionary version that only some people, only special people really have this power and really have this authority to use it, ultimately kind of start to coalesce in the 20th century in really interesting ways, particularly as it happens in the second half of the 20th century in the sort of cultural miasma of California, out of which comes the birth of basically the internet as we know it today. First networked computing, networked computing, the internet, and ultimately this kind of Silicon Valley culture. Steeped in these ideas of steeped in mid-20th century counterculture, the futurist technologists and inventors who would ultimately come to shape what we now think of as Silicon Valley culture share with their Hermetic forebears an optimistic vision of human self-transcendence through technology. They all envision something very similar to the kind of the Hermetic ideal, that freed of our biological and geographic constraints, of repressive social expectations, we can make of cyberspace a kind of new libertarian Jerusalem. As early as the 1960s, the futurist Stuart Brand, who's the publisher of a counterculture Bible known as the Whole Earth Cataloged, rhapsodized about how in the modern world, and I'm quoting here, the realm of intimate personal power is developing. The power of the individual to conduct his own education, find his own inspiration, shape his own environment, and concludes, echoing a little bit of Brian Johnson, or heralding Brian Johnson here, we are as gods, and we might as well get good at it. And this idea sort of continues throughout the early decades of Silicon Valley culture, of the counterculture, ultimately of sort of early internet culture. In the 1990s, there was an organization first known as the Extropian Institute, later the World Transhumanist Association. It is now known as Humanity Plus. Founded in 1992 by a philosophy student who chose the name for himself Max Moore, because it sounded cool, and his vision was similarly that human beings should use this new technology. They should use biohacking and network computing in order to make themselves into something more than merely human. That they should, quote, seek more intelligence, wisdom, and effectiveness, and indefinite lifespan, and the removal of political, cultural, biological, and psychological limits to self-actualization and self-realizations. So once again, there's this fascination with the idea that technology can liberate us from human limitations. It can make us into something more than human, make us perhaps even immortal, and ultimately make us into gods. And while the sort of gnosis that's going on in here is maybe less about sort of personal spiritual knowledge and a lot more about technological knowledge, can we figure out how to do this? The fundamental idea is the same, that some people, the smart people, the people who know how to use the power of technology, have not just the possibility, but in fact have the moral right, the moral authority to attempt to use that technology in order to usher in the era of the post-human. Unless you think this is just sort of a bunch of weird dudes in the 90s, this is really becoming increasingly mainstream. Interest in transhumanism, and in particular the kind of apocalyptic but positive vision of what the post-human might be, has become pretty much normalized in Silicon Valley culture. Nearly every high-profile billionaire in the tech space has donated or invested in transhumanist initiatives. Peter Thiel, the PayPal founder and contrarian investor, has funded initiatives investigating radical life extension. The Russian billionaire Dmitry Itskov has funded the transhumanist Randall Koehn's Carbon Copies project. Elon Musk Jeff Bezos, have also funded transhumanist initiatives. And in fact, one of the most famous transhumanist futurists, Ray Kurzweil, is now the director of Google's Department on Artificial Intelligence. So this is, again, this is not a fringe idea. This is something that I would say is considered normal, exciting. Brian Johnson, he might be a little showier than the average, but he is not an exception. But I'm actually less interested in what Brian Johnson is doing than I am in what we're all doing, which is to say, I'm more interested in the popularity of manifesting than I am in what Brian Johnson is, whether or not he's injecting himself with the sun's blood. Because Brian Johnson might be a little bit of an anomaly in terms of money, in terms of power, in terms of influence. But I believe that Brian Johnson and your average TikTok manifesting influencer are two sides of the same coin. They're both interested in, obsessed with this idea that what it means to be human is to tap into a fundamental metaphysical truth about who we are, to tap into this sort of energy, to use knowledge and power in order to transcend human limitations. That this is something that we have the capacity to do, the right to do, and the obligation to do. And I'm not going to say that they're right, exactly, but I will say that on the internet, in the world of the internet, manifesting works more than it does in the real world. And I want to leave you with this thought. And what I mean by that is that if there is anywhere where wanting something makes it true, where turning your desires or your attention to something can change it, it is in fact in the contemporary internet, in the algorithmically driven internet of the attention economy, where if you click on something because you like it, more of it's going to follow you around the internet. If you've ever, done some online shopping and put something on your favorites list and then it follows you around the internet, for example, your desire is changing your landscape. If, for example, somebody makes a particularly compelling meme, a conspiracy theory perhaps, or a bit of disinformation that goes viral, that can change a popular imagination about a particular issue, be it a political conspiracy theory, be it the efficacy of vaccines. Suddenly, something that somebody says, if they say it convincingly enough, if enough people believe it, or at least retweet it, or like it, or share it, can start to change public perception, which in turn changes can change our economic and political reality. It will change how people spend their money. It will change how people vote. I was reminded of this just a couple of days ago when a basically random tweet about the possibility of Trump suspending his tariffs caused the market to, caused the stock market to go basically to plummet, then rise, then plummet again incredibly quickly, because the power of one tweet, which goes viral to start a rumor, to kind of enter the news cycle, can in fact change people's lives. So it may be that in the real world, so to speak, manifesting is a bit of a fantasy. But for the first time, I think, for those of us in the internet age, we are living in a world that does in fact run on desire, where desire is the engine of so much of our economic lives, our political lives, our personal lives. I want to be clear, I don't think that is a good thing. I'm not in favor of that. But I think it's something really worth considering. That if this kind of magical transhumanism is in fact our new civil religion, it is in part because we spend so much of our lives plugged into a world where that is in fact true. I'm going to leave it there. Thank you all so much.
Who's got the first question?
Thank you. That was very cool. My name's Colin.
Colin.
So my question is, it seems like a lot of the major thinkers who pursued this thought of self-divinity really only thought of it for an elite group of people. Was there any groups that generally thought of it as like something that should be implemented for the greater good, like for the common person? I don't know if you.
That's a really good question. I'd say generally no, but with exceptions. And I think actually, insofar as Freemasonry did allow for communication between people who were interested in sort of ideas that ultimately took the form of liberal democracy, Freemasonry as a, I don't want to say a secret society, as a fraternal order did tend to be associated much more with the spread of liberal and democratic ideas, and particularly in opposition to other forms of authority, particular church authority, became associated with the spread of the kind of ideas that would ultimately inspire people to be involved with both sort of liberal democratic causes, particularly in the United States, and also nationalist causes. So, for example, the rise of nationalism in Italy at that time particularly against the Austrian Empire, which sort of had occupied parts of the country that would become Italy, was spread through Masonic groups and national sort of semi-Masonic groups known as the Carbonari. So Giuseppe Garibaldi, for example, was a Mason. And again, I think sometimes I feel like it's strange to talk about Masonry in this way, because for those of us who grew up with the Da Vinci Code, one thinks of the Freemasons as something kind of scary and spooky. But I think what we're actually just talking about is groups of people who are using fraternal organizations, often with a kind of somewhat sacralized set of the regalia and the rituals and the initiation rituals and what have you, but in order to kind of make a political point against the Catholic Church. I think like an interesting analog might be the way that witchcraft is used in sort of between 2016 and 2020 as a sort of anti-Trump phenomenon, which is all to say, a long way of saying, yes, the Masons tended to be more democratic, but by and large, this idea of it only being for a chosen few tended to be much more prominent in pretty much all of these either organizations or texts. There's always a real focus on these are for the initiates. I mean, even the idea of esotericism comes from the followers of Pythagoras, where the people who were exoteric were the people who were sort of the outer room, who heard the simple version of what he had to say, but the people who were in the inner room, the inner circle, got to hear the more unfiltered truth. So there's always been that sense that it's only for the few.
Thank you for being here, Dr. Burton. I'm curious if you've done any research into the Church of Scientology, L. Ron Hubbard, and Dianetics, kind of the levels of the soul that through auditing we can raise our, this high understanding, whatever. I mean, it just seems everything you're saying is encompassed in a present religion that is prolific and dangerous or popular and with the media and everything. So I'm just curious if you had done any research on that.
Is this being recorded? I will say only, without making any comments about my personal experience writing about this, that it is historically true that the Church of Scientology does keep track of writers who write about it, and is legal action has been documented against people who write about it, which makes it perhaps not, I think if one is going to write about Scientology, one makes it one's entire life to do that well. And I, in this particular book project, do not have the time or resources or money for a lawyer to do so.
Interesting.
Before I pass it to other people's hands, I'm curious. So the three examples you used at the beginning. So we've got Brian Johnson, everybody here manifesting, and the Equinox ads, right? They're all coming from American popular culture. Can you talk a little bit more as why is this idea does it find particularly fertile ground in America?
Oh yeah, that's a great question. So yeah, it is a distinctly American phenomenon, and I think that insofar as it is global through the proliferation of American culture. And I think there's a couple of reasons for that. One of which is that what I call in Strange Rights intuitionalist religion as opposed to institutionalist religion. The idea that religion should be about what you feel and your personal connection with God has always been particularly, it has always flourished here. And this is true in the days of Methodist circuit riders, and it is true in the days of Billy Graham megachurches, and it is true in the days of the 60s counterculture, that there is, something to American culture and its distrust of authority that has often made it home to religious movements that focus on the self. There's a great book by Gilbert, I believe Seldes is how you say his last name, called The Stammering Century, about this phenomenon in the 19th century in particular. But I think it's also the case that, speaking more anecdotally here, you find a lot more, I think both anecdotally and only within Europe, which is where I have sort of some degree of knowledge, which is that more people might consider themselves religious but not spiritual there. Where, for example, cultural Catholicism is particularly strong, you might have people who do not think of themselves as believing in anything, but they'll still go to mass on Christmas because that's what their grandma does, or that's just tradition, and that does mean that they have certain kinds of communal and ritualistic roots that mean they might be less inclined to go and seek out a sense of purpose, or to seek out a sense of meaning, or to seek out spiritual things, because they still sort of don't need to, because even in the absence of belief or kind of a religious life, in the absence of belief, they still have access to certain kinds of communal religious life. Whereas I think it's more likely in the United States that someone might feel like they don't have access to that at all, and then they go looking and they get really into what they find.
Thank you very much. I'm sure I have a lot of questions to ask you, but I sort of see the way that ads like the Equinox one play into the I want to say motives of sort of Tealite, like technocrats, like readers of Curtis Yarvin, stuff like that. And so I'm wondering about when we consume ads such as those, how do we resist that? How do I tell people not to buy into that? That's basically my question.
Get one of these. Flip phone. No, I'm serious. I cannot emphasize enough, just get a flip phone. I have done it. It has been life-changing. But I will say, I think recognizing that our attention span, our imagination, is being sort of systematically hijacked by the attention economy. And what I mean, I think there's an irony that I don't have time to get into it at length here, but so much about this sort of these magical ideas are about the power of the imagination, and they're particularly about magic is often understood, and you find this in figures as old as Giordano Bruno, this sort of magician from the 1500s, as you do in the contemporary era, is about if you can harness someone else's imagination, if you can harness their capacity to attend to things, to imagine things, if you can manipulate that, that's what magic is. And I think that understanding that basically advertising and mass media, whether or not you believe in the sort of supernatural elements of magic, do operate in the way that people who wrote about the magic in the Renaissance could only have dreamed of magic working, mean that I think the appropriate response to the algorithmically driven internet, I'm not sure about the internet more broadly, is of extreme defensiveness and resistance. So I personally, I got my flip phone. I've got this in grayscale because the red that is often used in Mac notifications is specifically designed to give us a dopamine hit. But I think, there's no such thing as being too paranoid or defensive when it comes to not letting people who stand to profit off your imagination, not letting them do that.
Thank you. My name's Noah. Thank you for coming today. I'd like to hear you speaking on something that's really relevant, interesting in our lives. So talking about the whole manifesting thing, seems like people who are kind of struggling with mental health issues tend to use self-care as a remedy. But are you arguing that will end up, making things worse for people? And if so, how?
So I'm not sure that manifesting and self-care are identical. I think that there's a degree of, there's nothing wrong with a sort of degree of self-care in its proper place. There's no one who probably couldn't benefit from a cup of tea and a bubble bath. But I think my concern with manifesting specifically is not it's that it's confusing a couple of different things. And I think that there's a sort of weak version of manifesting that is actually a little bit more like pop psychology, which is that if you walk into a room with confidence, you are more likely to get what you want than if you do not walk into a room with confidence. Stress is hard on the body, and therefore you are probably, if you minimize your stress and take care of your mental health, it will be better for your physical health than not doing that. I think that it is reasonable to have a sort of very, very, very mild response to manifesting that just reflects the fact that it is probably good to, that how you present yourself and the relationship of the mind and the body are sufficiently intertwined that there's some benefit in doing that. Where I think it gets dicey, or what I would want to caution against, is this idea, that there's some kind of energy at the heart of the universe that you can access, that you're accessing divine energy. And I think, because either that is true and you're sort of messing with the force, and I think this is actually the sort of nihilistic shadow side of that assumption that kind of comes out in a lot of accounts of it. It's just basically you're saying there's really nothing but human perception. The closest thing you can do to be a god or to be magical or to attain divine power is just to convince people of things. It's just to lie to people. And by shaping other people's reality, by shaping their, by psychologically or, manipulating them, by having the right memes, by creating a certain perception, you are able to make reality. And this is something that I sort of didn't have time to get into in this lecture. It's something that I think is particularly prevalent in what I call that reactionary strain of magic. People like Julius Evola, who is very, for whoever brought up Curtis Yarvin over there, someone who does have a large influence on contemporary neo-reactionary culture. But there is, I think that ultimately manifesting seems kind of cool and fun when you're thinking I'm getting in touch with the universe. But the shadow side of it is, to me, incredibly nihilistic. It's this idea that all that really matters is vibes, and all that vibes are is what you can make people think.
Hi, I'm RJ.
Hi.
Sorry. I just had a question. You mentioned something that kind of resonated with me. You said that Cosimo Medici, when he was translating those texts, said, put down Plato, put down these other people that are talking about how to live a virtuous life. I want to know how to become a god, basically with these texts. And I kind of want to know to what extent saying transhumanism is just a glorification of, this is the epitome of human greed. Like us here in this room might want to become a billionaire, but these billionaires have nothing left to desire but to become a god. To what extent is this just a glorification of that?
Yeah, I think you are right that is a huge part of that. I think this idea of self-divinization is interesting, particularly in Brian Johnson's case, because simultaneously he has this vision of himself as a kind of god in the technological sense, but he's also, he is just kind of a wellness influencer. He is Gwyneth Paltrow's Goop, but with this kind of exciting tech cast. And I think one of the questions that then remains is what someone like Brian Johnson is doing, is it about the money? Is it about the power, or is it about other people's attention? Is it about kind of getting everybody to look at him? And I think that is I do not know the man. I do not know his personal psychology, but I think that is an interesting tension. Is, if you do have all the money in the world, what is the next horizon? What is the next thing you can conquer? And I think Brian Johnson does see it very much as this is just what you do. When you've succeeded here, you succeed there. When you've succeeded there, you succeed there. And I will say, I think one of the reasons that the sort of magical transhumanism has historically been popular among scholars, scientists, and actually also artists and writers, people like everyone from Kandinsky to T.S. Eliot to Yeats was into it, is I think human beings really respond to the idea that the one weird thing that is really important to being human is the one weird thing that we personally are really good at. And I think, in a society that is where people who are technologically gifted or have command of certain kinds of scientific knowledge might be getting more and more power, it does seem rather convenient to imagine or valorize a system, sort of metaphysical system in which important qualities towards accessing divinity are not necessarily a tradition or the divine right of kings or military strength, but being good at science and technology. So I think it might just be a sort of, we all do kind of construct the divine in our own image, regardless of who we are.
We've got time for a couple more questions, if there's hands out there.
Thank you very much for your talk. It's fascinating and disturbing as well. Partly because the goal that these entrepreneurs are claiming to, or this spirituality is striving for, becoming one with God, tapping into the divinity of the universe, is in fact something that is at the heart of Christianity, for example, except that the means of achieving it is not by attaining more clicks, but rather by loving your enemies, instead of harnessing the power of the cosmos and all the coal-burning plants to generate power for data centers. It involves self-sacrifice and loving the least among us. This eternal life that they strive for, is it just going to be more of what we've got right now, just continued indefinitely? Or is the notion of mercy, of the genuine divine qualities, not just not dying, which is, I don't want to die either, it's a nice thing to have. In a shorthand, is this eternal future going to come with ads?
Ads, I don't know, only because the ones who are living forever are not necessarily the ones watching the ads. But I will say, I do not see, in this group of entrepreneurs, a particular focus on what one might consider the Christian virtues. If anything, I think that there's a really strong neo-Nietzschean tendency. And I know, I think Elon Musk very recently sort of gave an interview where he talked about empathy being, one of the big world problems. And this is, I think actually this is sort of a meme in that space, that one of the things that, quote unquote, Western society has, quote unquote, lost is this understanding of an appreciation of natural hierarchies. And this obviously gets taken in very, all the racial and gendered directions that you would expect people to take that language. But basically, I think a real, particularly in the past decade or so, particularly as a kind of as a cudgel response to what was then known as social justice culture and then became known as wokeness, there's a very, very, very strong kind of anti-mercy, anti-humility, anti-equality tendency in this contemporary version of transhumanism. One that I would say was prefigured in the 19th century version of this in Europe, where, as I said, the interest in magic once again kind of came as a it was an anti-democratic response to what was seen as the disenchantment of the world, but also the flattening of difference through liberal democracy and the rise of the middle classes, and magic was seen as a sort of development of a spiritual aristocracy. That is very much, especially channeled through figures like Curtis Yarvin, part of this contemporary sort of techno-transhumanism. I would say it's not just that it is morally neutral, but it is actively opposed to what it would see as the valorization of weakness, even though they might not understand that weakness. Like, they would be more likely to call that weakness wokeness than to think of it as Christian.
Thanks so much. Really great presentation. I'm Raymond Hain in Philosophy and Humanities. I just wanted to ask a question about the way you structured your presentation. So much of your comments were about the history, intellectual history of a certain sort. And you're sort of both considering a variety of things that seem entirely new, and then putting them in a context that makes them seem old and cyclical. And so one thing I'd like to ask is, why did you do it that way? Like, why is history so important to you in the way you're framing the moment we're in right now? And sort of related to that is, I mean, the question sort of everyone would probably like to ask is, where are we headed? And that's very difficult to say anything of substance about. But the way you framed the question makes me think you might have opinions about that, because you're thinking about a particularly cyclical phenomenon. That, oddly enough, and I won't say this as a question, but seems to start with Christianity.
So, sorry, I'm going to try to answer different parts of that question. I want to actually answer something I didn't comment on a previous part of the question that I think is relevant here. Is I do actually think what's interesting about Christianity is that it is sort of transhumanist and sort of not, which is, I think, historically what interests me about the history of these sort of magical movements is partly because they come out of the same intellectual background as proto-Orthodox Christianity, that I think we can understand these movements better as, so I'm speaking from a Christian perspective here, understanding them as heresy rather than paganism, so to speak. The book, I'm not necessarily writing this book from a sort of obviously confessional perspective, but I think that understanding that there is something vital and important to, there is some divinity in the human being, or we are, there is something about what it means to be human that involves somehow kind of, we're not sure, we need to work this out as a problem, being a bit like God. That is the same kind of starting point that sort of animates a lot of Neoplatonic discourse, and it animates a lot of like Neoplatonic Jewish discourse, and the Gnostics, and the Hermetists, and those people who finally sort of codify their version, the version I happen to subscribe to, into Christianity. And I do think that one of the reasons that I want to structure this book that I'm writing historically, and I will say it's early enough in the process, I'm still not sure if the book is going to be more historical or contemporary. But I do kind of want to, what I don't want to do is present this as a kind of Christianity versus paganism narrative, and I think that there are books, including books I like and respect, who take that view. Whereas I actually think that this is a question of how do we understand this particular, and I would say particularly, post-Christian, I think Tom Holland writes about this in his book Dominion, which is very good, this post-Christian celebration of something about the autonomy and dignity of the self, while also perhaps avoiding certain kinds of celebration of human technological ability at the expense of something that we're clearly losing. So to answer then the final part of your question about where we're going, I'm feeling pretty pessimistic for this year, as I think many of us are. The one thing where I do think I see some optimism, I do see more and more people kind of opting out of the internet bubble. Like I was joking about my flip phone earlier, but I speak at a lot of college classes, and I am seeing more college students choosing to have flip phones. I am seeing more college students, younger people, choosing to not be on social media. I have seen more people with print books and print journals in New York City in the past year than I have since I was a kid, if even then, since before anyone had a smartphone. And I don't think that's necessarily going to be something that scales to the extent that it is could be society changing. But I think that there is a growing sense that if we stay in that world, there is going to be a particular kind of end to the internet world, and it is not going to be good. And the best thing we can do is to attempt to resist it as much as possible. And I'm seeing a growing interest in resisting that. So I'm hardened by that, if by nothing else, and even if I'm not sure where that's going, how significant that's going to be on any kind of national level.
Do not resist the urge to join us down the hall for the reception, and please give a warm round of applause to Dr. Burton.